Good morning. Good morning. I'm just so excited. I got to pick my walk-up music, and that's a bucket list. I got to walk up to the Beastie Boys. So obviously I don't have a bow tie on. A bit of a joke in the back. I do have bow ties on very regularly, but if you do any amount of speaking, this is what we affectionately call the hangover shift. The first speaking engagement of the last day of the conference. And I'll tell you a little something about bow ties. It actually takes a little bit of dexterity to tie them. And this morning I was not able to muster that level of dexterity. So before I get started, it's always important to cover the so what. Why should we listen to this guy? Where does he come from? Many of you have probably heard me speak in any number of engagements. But for those that haven't, over the last 25 years, I have been heavily involved in IT operations, came through the tech project manager route, ran a little merger integration called Bank One and JP Chase years ago, stepped out, became a chief information officer, gravitated eventually into the cybersecurity trades. And the thing that really stands out in my background is I brought together and created the centralized identity management organization at JP Chase. So that doesn't mean that I'm an expert in anything. Those of you that watch the Deadpool movie, before Deadpool actually made the major transformation, he was really known for speaking very pragmatically and sharing his thoughts, and he was beaten for it regularly. And it was only after he took a huge number of beatings did he clearly understand his purpose in life. And that's my value to you. I've taken a lot of beatings, and I know what it's like to manage at scale, volume, and the difficulties that we face in the identity world. I've also worked in risk and compliance, as well as I said, being a CISO. And the truth of the matter is that maybe you shouldn't listen to me, because it's pretty clear I haven't been able to keep a steady job for more than about 2 years. But the diversity of experience has been very, very helpful in framing up understandings relative to cybersecurity that many folks are just starting to understand now. So I'm an operator. I moved into advisory consulting and solution support in the last couple of years, but I've sat in the seat. And that's the most important thing I can share with you. Now, I'm an extemporaneous speaker. I don't speak from a script. It's always fun, because it's more like NASCAR. You might have come to see the crash and burn, as opposed to really get anything out of value out of this, but I hope that's not the case. So let me get started here and talk for just a second about what's happening in the world of our adversaries, our enemies. If we think about what's going on, Lumberman and Gerstner, two great research firms, have stated that hackers are increasing their technology spend by 30% per year and getting tremendous budgetary pressures. Hacking organizations are struggling to find talent. Hackers are constantly struggling for their share of departmental budget. And most importantly, hackers are encumbered with an ever-increasing burden of regulatory and compliance demands. We all feel bad for the hackers, right? I mean, and we know that this is all a lie. And I apologize for starting out by lying to you first thing in the morning, but it's frustrating when we consider the fact that if we did a transaction-on-transaction analysis, it is cheaper for hackers to hack us today than it was 5 years ago. They're not hacking us with more and more sophisticated technologies. In fact, this is an important point that I need everyone to clearly understand relative to your role within your company. You cannot walk through your company's halls and talk to your executives and shout, "Identity is the new perimeter," without acknowledging that Bob in accounts receivable is literally port 80, right? If identity is the new perimeter, then each individual in your organization is simply a port in that perimeter. They are an access pathway. And this is why the path of least resistance has become the preferred method of hackers. And if we think about what's actually going on, we're seeing a collapse of our security solutions because of that simple email. Please open this invoice from Mary at Skynet and modify the shipping charges. Click. Done. And everything that we've invested in, everything that we are trying to manage from a control standpoint has been subrogated. Everything has been bypassed with one click. And they're scoring more and more and more on these effective exploits. And that's frustrating to me because I do believe that what we're spending and the time that we're putting into controls isn't just absolutely necessary. It's just fundamental to what we have to do every single day. But if we're getting beat on easier and easier hacks, it raises a question, what's wrong? We're not being outspent. If you notice the title, I didn't say anything about being outspent. We're being outmaneuvered, we're being outgunned, we're being outmanned. So if we look at what's going on in terms of being outgunned, I love analogies and metaphors. We continue, in the solution space, we continue to buy 50 caliber machine guns. And we are being beat by dozens of people with 38 specials, right? We're being beat in the small arms race because we're outmanned, we're outgunned, we're outmaneuvered. When we think about outmanned, nation-state actors in particular, and well-known hacking consortiums and co-ops are winning the recruiting war. I mean, that's troubling to me, ethically, morally, culturally, that there is a perception that working on that side of the equation is more lucrative, more beneficial than working for us. But there's a lot of talented people on that side. We tend to diminish that reality. But there are a lot of talented people on the other side of that line, and we're losing that recruiting war. And we're outmaneuvered. Every attacker is seeking that path of least resistance. And we're not putting a lot of focus in our solutions, processes, and people on those paths of least resistance. We're putting them on the big blocks. So when we think about what's going on here, that ugly truth that we kind of need to reconcile ourselves to, I felt it was necessary to use a lot of random capitalization in my first statement, because if you do a lot of presentations, that's really important, that stuff up there. Every successful exploit in the last decade, maybe in history, has been facilitated by a failure in core identity controls. Every single one. I don't quite understand the things that come out of any number of organizations that research breaches that say that 81% of hacks can be attributed to credential hijacking, or it can be account usurpation. I'm like, how can it be 81%? Like, what's the other 19% that doesn't need an account to execute? I can't figure that part out. I think it's 100% has to do with identity being bad at the core. So if we put that another way, no one has made the news because their sexy, expensive Magic Quadrant nuclear-powered artificially conscious identity platform has failed. Nobody. I mean, I don't know about you, but I haven't seen a news article that attributes an exploit or a breach to a specific security solution. Now, believe me, the security solution providers don't want to be at the end of that catastrophic spear, right? They don't want to be the reason that you were breached, but in truth, history shows us that they never have been. So it's not a tech problem. It is a process and people problem. But more to the core of it, it just simply is a lack of emotional investment. Now, I need to get into intimidation mode. I probably was a little too glib about the bow tie. I decided that I needed to be in character for this particular part. So, and my kids don't call this intimidation mode. They call this I'm bringing a new date over to the house to meet dad mode. And I want you to feel what I'm getting ready to share with you. So I'm a big believer. A lot of people talk about me speaking as a pragmatist and common sense and matter-of-factly, but I'm just a big believer in the strength and the power of storytelling. But not just storytelling for the purpose of storytelling. Storytelling that matters and impacts you directly and drives a point home. Now, I get it already that we're uncomfortable, because that slide, that picture, that's just icky. Like, that's it. Unfortunately, from the back, there are a few people at the conference that actually look like this guy. Kind of caught my attention while I was walking around. But we're losing not because of technology. We're losing because of emotional investment. Our companies, our employees, our leaders, our cultures, our policies, none of them are attuned to the correct level of emotional investment. Now, at this point, you're going, what is this guy talking about? So I have been really, really fortunate to have a very diverse life. That's what happens when you can't keep a job for more than 2 weeks. I'm actually an elected official. Now, I want to be very, very clear in today's political climate. I am a nonpartisan elected official. I sit on the board of the 10th largest school district in the state of Ohio. Size and scale matters in this particular case with what I'm about to share with you. Before I get started, show of hands, how many of you have children in school K through 12? Show of hands. Outstanding. Half to 3/4 of the audience. So here's the thought exercise. You love your child's school. You love everything about the school, the location, the teachers, the administration, the principal, the lunch lady, the bus drivers. You are invested in your child's education and well-being, and that school is too, and it means everything to you. You receive a phone call. It's a voicemail. Comes through the contact system in your school district. And that voicemail is a familiar voice. It's the administrative assistant that works at that school. You know this person. That person leaves the following voicemail. There is somebody inside of our building. We don't know where they are. We don't know what they look like. We don't know if their intentions are good or bad. Heck, we don't know how long they've been here. We don't know how they got here. Who's feeling good about that? Who's feeling good about that when that message closes with, everything's cool? Anybody? I know I don't. Just shout it out. What are you doing in that moment? Anybody? Calling, texting, driving to the school? Do we have that same level of emotional investment when we discover an unknown entity inside of our companies? Does anybody reach that level of freak out panicness and say, we don't know who this person is, we don't know who this account is associated to, we don't know why this transaction was executed? Now, what we do is we go, oh man, my monitoring system throws so many false positives. I told you, I've done this job for a long time. Let's just change the rules so we can bucket all of that noise. And if we change the rules so we don't have all that noise, the risk goes away. Now, one of the things that's interesting before I get off of this example of emotional investment, what's cool, I always believe in this notion of being able to make the analog equivalent within the digital realm. I think we do a very bad job of this. I was having some conversations on this yesterday. Look, we need to remember that digital transformation, digital enablement, digital everything is simply an electronic representation of real life. We miss this part. Nothing in the digital realm happens simply because it's divested from its analog counterpart. Now, the difference is the speed of light and, packets, all these types of things. It's speed and volume. But in truth, everything in the digital world reflects what's going on in the analog world. So if we think about that example that I just gave you about the school, I just described your corporate client-server environment. I told you I work as an elected official. My school district is 15,000 kids, 1,171 teachers, 1,400 staff and administrators, and anybody else who keeps wandering in and out of the building. And when I get that phone call from the administrative assistant that you love, I get the same phone call, and amongst the 37 buildings in my district, nobody can tell me which one. From an identity standpoint, I actually just described the cloud. You have to learn how to use these stories to drive that emotional reaction, not fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And I'll mention that in just a minute. What do we need to be focusing on? Well, first of all, we need to come back to our roots. Again, show of hands. How many folks with long, deep technical backgrounds outside of security? You worked app dev, infrastructure, database, yeah. Because of the growth of security technologies and the speed and the pace in which we've had to do them, literally, there is an entire host of companies, an entire, multi-billion category dollar of spend that if I was standing here 10 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about because it didn't exist. That's how fast we've had to move. But in moving fast, we've forgotten a lot of our core values and roots in the technology communities. A great example of this, for me, is identity platforms, bar none, right? You have somebody that shows up, says, hey, I got a great new identity solution. It's going to solve all your problems. Now, right there, I will tell you from experience, your best move is just to ask that person to leave, because it's not true. A tech platform is not going to solve all of your problems. But if we think about this even further, you say, I got this cool identity platform, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of the unstructured, non-standardized, highly suspect, inconsistent, incomplete, and often corrupted base data, Active Directory records, anybody? And I'm going to jam it into this really, really cool identity solution, and out are going to come unicorns and rainbows on the other side. We have forgotten the basic, fundamental garbage in, garbage out. This puts all of us at a disadvantage. It puts our customers at a disadvantage because they believe they're going to get a solution that's going to fix things that they forgot or failed to fix themselves several years before. Right? When I walk into a client and they tell me, I've had these solutions in place, and I say, when was the last time you did Active Directory hygiene? They go, well, that project got defunded last year, and it's probably not going to get funded this year. And I go, do you understand, when you get hacked, the very first place that the bad guys go is Active Directory, looking for disabled, obsolete, highly privileged accesses. They bundle those things around them, and they cover themselves in them, and lo and behold, another topic I speak about frequently, they're not an outsider. They're an insider. If you don't believe me, take a look at your own monitoring programs, and if you can catch anybody inside of your system that has accumulated all of these different accesses and is functioning based upon the privileges and entitlements associated with these accesses, you have a monitoring system that I would really like to see. So we know that this garbage in, garbage out principle has contributed to our challenges, but if we take a look at what's really kind of pulled this down and why have we gone this direction with less and less expensive hacks beating more and more complicated and pricey solutions, it's everything that's related to identity. This gets back to the core. This is why identity-centric security is the only way that we can win. Basically, everything that we've spent has been sub-optimized by phishing, social engineering, identity theft, account hygiene, and absentee ownership. Absentee ownership being a very, very big one that we can talk about for hours, but I got 9 minutes and 47 seconds left. So how do we start to fix this? I talked a little bit about the principles that we've forgotten as technologists. There are great things in our past that we need to return to. Show my age, Demings, right? TQM, constant process improvement. Many of those principles are absent from most cybersecurity organizations today. And we need to change that. So I'm always talking about bringing back zero defect. And if you spend any time in the engineering trades, you understand that zero defect does not equal perfect. And I get this a lot when I bring this up to executives, boards of directors. They go, well, it's really difficult. It's very complicated. We got tons and tons of people, and they're in 52 countries, and it's really hard. Yeah, it is really hard. But zero defect is not asking anybody to make it perfect. Great example, Active Directory. Is it clean, controlled, and accurate? Okay, if it's not, that's a defect, folks, right? That's not a broken system. That's defective information. Your CMDB, this is always a fun one. I love that conversation that starts with, yeah, we've got this and we've got that, and everything's buckled down here, and I'm like, so how accurate and up-to-date is your CMDB? We don't really know, but We think it's pretty complete. The part that you don't know is the defect. Hammer those out of the system. Change management, is it guarded? Is it enforced? Is it isolated? You know, I'm always fascinated by the fact that we haven't conditioned HR policies to actual identity-related policy violations. So the 9th time that that dude with the heightened credentials that's an app, in app dev, and he goes in and he breaks into production, the 9th time, and you make a big deal about it and say, you know what, this guy really needs to go, and his manager goes, no, you don't understand. It's really hard to get these resources. If I have to open up a new rec, this is going to take forever. Oh my gosh, like, no, we can't fire him. Plus, there's no policy that says we need to fire him. And yet, the person that's really introducing, you're worried about external hackers, and this person that's introducing the most present and nascent risk in your organization is the person that you're going, yeah, give him a pass. That's a defect. It's just something that we allow to go through. And lastly, and around identity-related risk, this is a big one for me. Those of you that work in highly regulated industries, you know that the pending FFIEC PR, this regulation, the most onerous thing in that regulation is that there is a demand that you must communicate risk clearly in a language that your board of directors can understand. That's a big deal. There are a lot of companies that are going to struggle with that. And the reason is because everything that we try and pass through the funnel of board awareness gets whitewashed, shellacked, painted over by parties that have different interests. I'll go back to that white noise example. Has anybody ever seen a board presentation where the number of false positives in monitoring and analysis systems were presented to the board? I know it's not the case because your board would freak out. You're like, hey, we got tens of thousands of transactions, activities that we just don't even know what they're for, so we just kind of bucket them over there. Board of directors, we hope you're okay with that. Right? That's a defect. And we need to drive these defects out. Now let's talk a little bit about what's zero defect in action, right? Bringing back identity-centric solution. Because trust me, in the physical world, decades ago, physical security was based on identity, right? But if we think about this for just a second, look, it's a mess. Nobody owns identity in a company, right? If you ask who's the czar of identity, there is no such animal. I always love this because you always start with HR and they go, ooh, we own identity. And you go, cool. Can you tell me what access this employee needs on the day they start? They're like, oh, whoa. We don't own that part. We own paying them, right? We own getting them their retirement after they leave. That's the part that we own in identity. The line manager is like, oh, I own identity. Yeah. All the way up until the point you do certification, they go, man, I can't read that entitlement. What does that mean? I'm just going to click yes, because if I take that entitlement away, something might break. Well, they can't possibly own identity because they're ascribing attributes to somebody that probably shouldn't have something, so they own a piece. The Windows AD, these are my favorite folks. Windows AD folks are passionate. They go, we own identity. And I go, what about the stuff that's not federated AD? And they go, see ya. I'm out. And the IAM team, God bless you. We all say that we own identity, and we know that we don't. And we know that we own what we can control and what we can see, but we know that we're faced with, difficult challenges. So, just real quick, pause. Has anybody ever seen a hacker picture that didn't involve a hoodie? Yeah. I'm actually, when I retire, I'm actually going to start a hoodie company and call it Persistent Threat. Zero defect in action. Look, it's not just about people. It's about this. We've made this mistake for a long time. Your identity is not a sum total of accounts that roll up to a SSO account. That's like saying in the physical world, that's like me handing you 47 keys on a key ring and going, this is your identity. Your identity is context, content, and relationship. But there's a whole host of things in the identity world that require ownership that are out there. SSH keys, OEM accounts, API scripts, they're all out there. One of the best answers that I've ever gotten from an executive, it was like, he was telling me how cool his threat and vulnerability program was. And of course, east-west traffic, all these kinds of things were a big deal. And I said, sweet, how are you doing on SSH key management? And he said, and I love this, he said, I am confident that 100% of the SSH keys that we know about have owners. Yes! And that's the problem, right? It's the unknown stuff in our environment. It's what's not known, or the unknown that we get had on. And again, I'll tell you, that's not an uncontrollable quantity. It is a defect, and you need to pursue it as a defect. Every lack of ownership, everything that's not tied to something, you need to chase it down. Well, how do we go forward? First of all, if you've got any level of maturity in your identity control function, if you are not running a continuous back to basics identity control program as a part of that, you are either highly overconfident in your capabilities, or you're spending all of your money on cool new stuff and not spending any money on the basics. It just can't be any other way. So consider that as you go back home and you're talking about this with your executives. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I said I'd mention this again. FUD is not necessary, right? It is very simple to explain to people that it is impossible to hack without some form of identity control breach. That alone should make it the core of every company's security program. Executives, if I've got any in the room, stop believing the basics are too hard. There are no complicated solutions that fix basic controls, hygiene, and common sense. You cannot buy your way out of bad decisions relative to your underlying foundational controls. Stop your bad habits. This is a fascinating one. Does anyone notice that as the world has gotten faster and cheaper relative to CPU and storage, our habits have gotten worse and worse and worse? Don't believe me? How many of you have copies of production? Right? And each one of those copies of production has production data, and each one of those requires the same identity controls to make sure that they're safe and secure. Except you've expanded your landscape by about tenfold over what you really need operationally. Why do we do it? Because we don't trust our systems. And just in case something goes wrong, right? That's why we do it. Again, we need to stop these behaviors and focus on securitizing the core based upon identity. And if you get identity right, how many other things would get better alongside of security? Employees' experience, customer experience, obviously. I've said it before, and I'll leave you with this today. If we're not creating an identity-centric cybersecurity wrapper, the IDSA, our great infographic on that is such a great example. If at the core is not there, you're wasting money. Because that port 80, Bob, is still out there. And you need to harden your identity security to not sub-optimize those dollars, and you can't let a vendor tell you that their solution fixes all the problems if they can't answer the basic question, can you take bad information and turn it into gold? So ask yourself, is my security failure actually just a failing at identity? And if it is, how do I start to change it today? Thank you very much for your time, everyone. Truly appreciate it.